Hi there, I'm Mark from SpeedCurve, which is a great little boutique front-end monitoring company. And today we're going to talk about all of these nasty fellas. So I want to talk about all the web performance metrics that are out there and try to get to the bottom of what we mean by meaningful metrics. We're going to try and identify them and try and figure out what's really meaningful. Now, I know that meaningful is quite a loaded word, so what we want to do is ask ourselves, meaningful to who? What is it that we really care about, and what is it that we're trying to represent with all these metrics? There are literally dozens of performance metrics, but I believe we need to focus in on the metrics that really represent the core of what we are trying to deliver. And that, of course, is a really great user experience. It's our users that we should be trying to understand, and we should be letting them guide us towards the most meaningful performance metrics. After all, it doesn't really matter what service or product you're building, it's really our users that decide whether it's going to be successful or not. So we should be letting them lead. Now, too often our users are having a really awful and slow experience, especially when they're on slower devices. Not everyone is on those latest, greatest devices, as we've heard, and many of the next billion or so people that come onto the web for the first time are going to be doing so on those slow devices, over slow infrastructure, slow CPUs, and we can see the issues that we're going to have with JavaScript and things like that. So all those users want is really our awesome content. So when we talk about meaningful metrics, I believe we should be focusing our attention on the metrics that best represent those user experiences and what those users are actually seeing and experiencing. Now, with our user experience hat on, we can start to ask ourselves some questions. What are we looking for in these metrics? What do we want them to be representing? And so if we put that user hat on, we want to ask ourselves questions like, when did those users actually see some content? Not only that, that content that they saw, was it the really important content? Not all the pixels on screen are the same. And this is something that is often missed in our performance metrics. We really need to focus in on those elements that are important and the elements that people really want to see. And then once I can see that web page and I can see that experience, how long does it take me to interact with that page? Is there lag? Is the JavaScript getting in the way? So these are some quite simple questions, and ideally there should be some really nice simple answers to how we measure these. And while I love all the nuts and bolts of the web, the back end, the JavaScript frameworks, which image formats we can squeeze the most out of, unfortunately, users don't really care about any of that. They just don't care about your code or what your stack is. As much as we love to talk about that, users just want to get that great content. So how do we evaluate and go around picking the right metrics to represent that user experience? I've seen many wonderful talks on the intricacies of how those various performance metrics work. Some of them have quite complex algorithms behind them, and there's a lot of hype potentially about this new metric being the next best thing. There's been some great talks, particularly by Paul Irish, about the nuts and bolts of performance metrics, and I really recommend you go away and have a look at those if you're after those really detailed explanations of how each metric works. But that's not what I'm going to do here today. Rather than diving into those technical details of the various metrics, I'd like to propose a much simpler way of evaluating each metric. One that actually reflects what our users are doing on our sites every day. They're using their eyes. What are they looking at? Let's pick some metrics that actually reflect what our users see, what they care about, and reflect what it is that they're doing on those sites. And to actually see what our users see and relate that back to the different performance metrics we have, there's really only one tool to use, and that is good old web page test. We owe so much to this tool. It really is the giant whose shoulders we stand upon, and often I feel like this on a day-to-day basis. If I'm not on web page test, something's going wrong. So it really is at the core of many of the tools that we use. SpeedCurve is completely built on top of web page test, and so we rely on it so much in our community to evaluate our techniques and whether we've improved performance. So a huge thanks again to Pat Meenan for the tireless work that he does on web page test. Unfortunately, he's not here at this Fluent, but he promised he would be here next year. And so what is it specifically about web page test that we love so much? Why do we spend so much time in this tool? For me, it's actually one really simple thing. It's the film strip. I love this so much. It doesn't matter what you're doing in your browser with your techniques. Web page test is sitting there like this neutral observer. And it's just recording whatever is happening on screen at 30 or 60 frames per second. And so it helps move us away from the code and closer to the user, where we get that perspective from the user. And it allows us to see and keep top of mind what that user experience is while we then go and interrogate our data. So it allows us to relate all that performance data and metrics we have back to the film strip, so that we can see when an event happens and how we correlate that back. And there can be all sorts of information there, all sorts of data, what's happening with the browser main thread, all the events and metrics that get fired, what's happening on our network, and often we're evaluating that by relating it back to our film strip. Now, what if we could flip that on its head and do it the other way instead? What if we could pick a moment on screen, one that we care about, and have it tell us what metrics were fired at that time? So if we focus here on the headline, imagine if we could just pick that and it tells us which metrics fired at that particular time. Was it last painted hero? Was it first meaningful paint? Or was it start render? Maybe all three of those metrics represents that moment in time. Now, I'm lucky enough to work every day with this clever fish, Steve Souders, the godfather of the perf community. So one of the things that I enjoy the most about working with Steve is that he expresses his thought process and ideas through code. Much to my ongoing frustration, it's very hard to slip an idea past Steve without having the data to back it up. So when we talked about this idea of using the film strip to evaluate metrics, of course he went away and whipped up one of his fabulous experiments, and he called it the rendering metrics picker. So here's how it works. You have a film strip, and on this film strip, you're invited to pick the moment when you think the experience is ready. And ready can be quite a loaded term here. Is it when the very first pixel renders? Is it when what you think the most meaningful content on that page is ready? Or is it the very last moment when everything is rendered in the browser and it's visually complete? And when you pick one of these moments, then the metrics are revealed to show you which metric correlates the closest to that moment that you've picked. So we're going to do a few of these together, and this is where we're going to sing. So I don't know if you guys have read any of the articles this week, but there was a really nice story about TLS 1.3 and how, I didn't realise this, but the process that they go behind making decisions is that they all hum together. And the loudest hum is like a vote for which feature that you wanted introduced. And the reason they kind of hum is it sort of helps take some of the attention and the bias out of the process. So we're going to give that a crack now. So I'm going to call out the numbers, and I'm going to invite you all to hum for the moment that you think best represents this film strip being ready. You can hum loud, you can hum soft, high, low. Let's see if we can get a bit of music going. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Sounded like 2 to me. So now we see our kind of metrics. And so this is quite a fascinating process to go through, where for each film strip you think about how it renders and how that feels as a user experience. So let's go again, a bit louder this time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, look at that. That was definitely a 3. And you know, this is fun. We could just do this all day. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, look at that. See, I disagree. I went kind of number 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You guys sound great. This is great technique. I'm going to do humming more often. And I think I've got one more here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See, I went 2. So this is a really interesting kind of process to go through, and these are my results from looking at 150 of the most popular websites, and that's what I'm kind of used to help sort of guide the rest of the talk. And I'd really strongly encourage you to go and give this a crack yourself. It's really interesting to look at how each of these popular websites kind of render, which elements come up first, and sort of have a think about when it is that you think this experience is ready. And as you move through these 150, it tallies up at the side which are the metrics that correlate the strongest. So you can find that at lab.speedcurve.com. So together, the top 3 metrics capture about sort of 72% of the moments that correlate the strongest with what I believe users want, what they saw on the page that has meaning. So let's now take a look at these kind of top 3 in a bit more detail and find out what those metrics actually represent. So the first one is hero rendering times. This is actually a brand new metric that we've developed at SpeedCurve, and what this is doing is it's pulling out the key element on the page. We look for the H1 or the H2, we look for the largest image or the largest background image. And I've got a little example here of how that works. So if we go back to this film strip that we were looking at, using JavaScript, once the page loads, we identify the H1 on the page, and then we just measure its bounding box and where it is on the page. And then because we have the film strip, we can start to do some visual analysis. So we take the last visually complete frame and we chop out that part of the page that represented that element, and we have that there on the right. And then we're simply walking through the film strip from the very first frame all the way through until we get a match. So you can see here at the beginning at 0 seconds, the page is white, and when we do an image diff, there's a 99% difference. When we take a step further, that purple background comes in, but the web font has not yet rendered. So now we're at a 24% difference. And then finally, when we get to this point, everything kind of matches up. We know our H1 is rendered, and we know what point in the film strip that part of the page rendered as early as possible. And so we apply this technique to the headings and the largest image on the page. And that really kind of matches what it is that you often focus on the page. And we get 3 metrics back. And Paul Irish recently kind of proposed a bit of an improvement to this technique where rather than looking at all of them individually, we just collapse those together into what he called last painted hero. So we like the sound of this. Paul even hinted that we might be kind of adding it to kind of Chrome at some point, but it's a way to kind of really look in and identify when we think those hero moments are ready. And what it's doing is it's looking at your large kind of text and your largest image, and it's telling you the point that both of those are rendered. And you can see in this highlighted screenshot how closely that matches the content that I really care about as a user. And I'm also really happy to announce that we're working on a pull request to push this back into web page test. We're 90% of the way there. We're just waiting for Pat to review the pull request. And so hopefully in the next couple of weeks, Last Painted Hero along with the hero rendering times will be available in web page test public, and any other service that uses web page test under the hood should be able to access all these same metrics as well. So super excited about that. So the next metric that stood out here was good old speed index. This one's been around for a while and it still kind of holds its own. And again, this is looking at visual completeness over time. So if we look at these 2 film strips, we can see there the percentages of how visually complete each one is. So the top one, most of the page renders quite quickly, so we quickly get to 90%, whereas the bottom one, we only see the nav come in, and that sits at 18% all the way through. And then what we can do is we can graph that visual completeness over time, and even though these two film strips ended at exactly the same time, the journey of how those pixels rendered over time was very different. And so that's really where speed index comes from. It's this area or the volume of time that is above this curve. And so it's important to think about this not as a point in time, but as sort of Pat describes, it's the average time at which kind of visible parts of the page are displayed. So that's doing a great job to capture that median point at which most of the pixels are rendered in our experience. And so that's why that kind of featured really highly in our metrics that we were picking as well. The next one is first interactive. And we've been hearing more about this one recently due to the impacts of JavaScript. And this is what this metric really highlights. So let me kind of walk through what we're seeing here. This is a new JavaScript dashboard that we added recently. And the reason we added this is that over the last few years, we've seen a real move or a shift with performance problems away from what's happening in the network into what's happening in the CPU. As we move to more and more JavaScript, that can cause real performance problems on the client side. And I think we still have a bit of that myopic kind of view where as developers on the latest gear, we can push out those big React kind of frameworks and everything kind of runs fine for us. But when you put that on a median, average kind of mobile phone, then you run into kind of problems. And it was fascinating to hear kind of Adri's talk, with Netflix kind of, having those performance issues with React and having to do a lot of work to really tune that to make sure that they weren't degrading the experience because of JavaScript. So what we're looking at here is obviously film strip across the top. Down the bottom, we've got our browser main thread and all the activity that's going on, painting and function calls. And then in the middle here, the yellow is our just JavaScript requests. And the first part of it is in yellow is the network request. And then after that, we've got 2 blocks of color, and this is our JavaScript activity. So in green, we've got any activity that's on over 5 milliseconds, and anything over 50 milliseconds, which is, we know, is a good threshold when users start interacting with the page. If it takes more than 50 milliseconds to get a response, then that starts to affect user experience. And so those are highlighted here in red. And you can see how First Interactive, which is the green box there on the right, is actually pushed out by those red bars. And so that's what First Interactive is as a measure. It's waiting for the page to calm down, it's waiting for the CPU to calm down, and so any thrashing of the CPU over 50 milliseconds pushes that time out on the page. So it's a really good indicator of how well behaved your JavaScript is. And I've got another example here which I find really fascinating, because I think normally when we look at a network waterfall, we think that the JavaScript is downloaded and then immediately it's parsed and executed. And it's only when we really start to look at when JavaScript actually fires that we see that that can quite often be a really different thing from reality. So here you can see this first request, yes, it downloaded, and it's stripy because it was a blocking script and there was a bit of activity off the back of it, but most of that activity is happening later in the page. Maybe it was just initialized and there were other functions that were calling that JavaScript that then led to it blocking for a good 200 or 300 milliseconds there. So you can see there's an early group of JavaScript there. What fascinates me is the lower right bunch of JavaScript. And when you look at those requests, they're the dirty old third-party requests. And they're JavaScript files that are coming in from retargeting kind of pixels and ad pixels. And I find that really kind of fascinating, because for a while now we've talked about as long as you can get the page rendered, then it's all right to fire off all those other requests. And you might have a whole lot happening in the background, but that doesn't really matter because it's not really impacting on user experience. And I think for the first time now, through visualizations like this, we're actually able to see that no, they do have an impact, and we can actually attribute that impact back to the specific scripts. And so here, this is CNN, dirty old CNN, we like to pick on it so much. It was really interesting because visually the headline and the image, everything there was there at about 3 seconds, but these pixel requests and them thrashing the CPU and taking up more than 50 milliseconds pushed out First Interactive to almost 10 seconds. And so it's really fascinating to see how much of a problem JavaScript is. And this is on a desktop CPU. You put this on mobile, throttle down the connection and throttle down the CPU, and this will lead to even more of a problem. So First Interactive is a really great measure of the JavaScript and how much CPU you're consuming. As mentioned, there's some other great kind of metrics that are in development. There's first input delay that's just measuring when I first interact with the page, how long does it take me to get a response. So that's a good one that's under development. There's long tasks as well. Long tasks is okay at the moment. It's telling you about how much activity there is on a page. Personally, I don't find it very useful until we can get to the point that we can actually attribute that activity either back to like a domain would be great, if not the actual script that was causing those long tasks. And so I believe that's in discussion at the moment about how we can improve that long tasks API to be able to get more attribution back. And the thing that's great about these two metrics is that we can use them in RUM. So we have them in our RUM tool and they're in Akamai kind of Impulse as well. So that can tell us about those CPU times in the wild. Now, for a talk about meaningful metrics, it would be odd not to mention some of these recent metrics that we've got from the Chrome team, especially things like first meaningful paint that sounded so promising. I mean, it has meaningful in the name. And yet I was really curious, like, why is it that these didn't feature highly when we looked at correlating them back to the user experience? Why was that? And good old Steve, he went out, he did more research, created more experiments for us to kind of dig into the bottom of this. And I think probably the way that I like to describe it is this is sort of the inside out problem, where you can't see your own context. And so Chrome only really knows about what's happening in Chrome. And so when Chrome sends pixels to the operating system, it doesn't really know how long it takes those pixels to get through the GPU, to get through the operating system, and to actually be visible on screen. And so when we looked at the video frames again and we looked at that analysis, you may have noticed that First Meaningful Paint, there was quite often just a white screen, or sometimes when we looked, the very next kind of paint event would be, it was close, but not that close. So when we did the analysis, it looked like there was about 100 to 200 millisecond delay. We did see some that went up to like 2 or 3 seconds delay between First Meaningful Paint and then the next key paint event that we saw in web page test. And so this is another reason why I love web page test so much, is that it's this neutral observer that's just recording video of exactly what's happening at the operating system level. These new metrics sound really promising, and they sound great. So I think it is worth keeping an eye on the paint timing spec. I was really disappointed to see that First Meaningful Paint is not in the paint timing spec, because that was certainly more useful than just First Paint or even First Contentful Paint, which when I look at the film strips don't really resonate with me. They're closer, but they're still not capturing what our users actually care about. So if we review what we've learnt so far from our users, I think we can it's best summed up by a quote from Steve here, and that is that any performance metric that values all the content the same is not a good metric. And this is why we saw Last Painted Hero perform the best when we compared it through to the user experience, as this metric is the one that really focused in on those hero elements, which is just what we do as users as well. Now, there are also things that we want as developers from our metrics. So let's add a few more requirements in for the things that our metrics need to answer. So as articulated by Steve, not all pixels have the same value, so we can use that to prioritize not only the content that we care about, but the metrics that we care about as well. We also want to know how hard is it to get this metric up and running. I'm lazy, you guys are lazy, how much work is it to implement these metrics? Do we have to go in and do a whole lot of work in our apps, or do we get it automatically? And also, how well does this metric actually represent real life? Can I get it in the wild through RUM, or is it a metric that only comes out of the synthetic lab? And do I also have a way to relate what I see in the wild with what I see in the lab and actually look at the relationship between those two environments and tune them together? So if we turn those requirements into a bit of a quadrant here and put all our metrics in, it starts to look like this. So along the top we have how much work is it to implement our metric? Does it require work, or do we get it automatically? And down the side, a really important distinction between, is it measuring our really important pixels that our users want, or is it just treating all pixels the same? And it's quite fascinating when you categorize it like this, that the bulk of the metrics that we have available today actually treat all pixels the same. Even First Meaningful Paint, which makes some attempt to differentiate, it doesn't look at images. And it just looks at the objects and the nodes that are being created in the DOM. And so to me, that's not meaningful. If you're not prioritizing the elements on screen that users really care about, then to me, that's still like treating all the pixels the same. So Last Painted Hero comes out really well here. Unfortunately, it's only available in synthetic. Maybe if Chrome do that work, we might also get it out of Chrome directly as well. User timing, we can get that both in RUM and synthetic, and that is a great metric, but it does require work, and I'll talk about that a little bit down the track. But yeah, so this again helps prioritize what it is that we want to focus on in terms of our UX metrics. So, what do we recommend? Here's what I recommend you should focus on. Last painted hero. I think this is going to be the metric going forward that we should all really focus on. And it's really that simple fact that it's representing the key elements that our users care about. It's the headline of the news article, it's the biggest image on the page. Most designs lend themselves to this metric being measured really well, and we get it automatically. Next, I would focus on first interactive. That represents our JavaScript, and that's a growing concern, and it's a really good metric to focus on how we're affecting the CPU in the browser. Then I would focus on start render, and I've kind of swapped this out for speed index. I like speed index, and I think it's a great metric, but I prefer start render. And the reason for that is that start render tells me about the critical rendering path in the browser. It tells me what's blocking those first set of pixels from actually being displayed on screen. So it's a good indicator of, do you have blocking CSS, do you have blocking JavaScript, which is actually getting in the way of anything being able to be rendered at all. So I would actually kind of swap that out. And then last but not least, I would add user timing. I think this is a fantastic metric that is underutilized. The reason it's underutilized is that it takes work to implement. You've got to kind of add it to your pages. You've got to be careful about how you add it to your pages to make sure that it's actually capturing the thing that you want. And so you can tune that in web page test, which supports user timing, to see and make sure that that metric is being fired and it's representing that moment that you care about the most. The reason I like it is that it can really simplify the story that you tell in an organization. So Twitter have time to first tweet. Pinterest has time to first pin. So if you think about your user experience, think about what is the moment that your user experience or your product is ready. And then you can use user timing to fire that metric when that first tweet is ready, or that first pin, or the hero product in your page. And the reason I like that so much is that it simplifies the conversation in an organization around performance metrics. You're not having to explain what speed index is. Like, that's always a challenge. Instead, you're just saying, hey, our time to first tweet is kind of X. And everybody can resonate that, whether it's the design team, the development team, management, everyone's going to rally around a nice simple metric like that. So that's where user timing is really important. So we've picked some metrics. How do we actually go about improving those metrics? And I'm going to have to race through this bit. So before we get into some of the nuts and bolts, I think there's an important conceptual shift that we need to make here. And that's that we move away from thinking about static pages, and that instead we think about what we're building as a time-based experience. And I think this is really critical in the way that we think about how we render and how we flow our content into the browser. Unfortunately, I think we still have challenges culturally in organizations. It's very easy for the marketing, the design team to run off and create big, beautiful Photoshop mock-ups of a big final rendered experience, to throw those over the fence to the development team. Then the developers do their best to try and race as quickly as possible to that final state. And God forbid they chuck like a spinner in there just to try and indicate, hey, we're trying really hard, but we haven't got there yet. So don't do that. Don't use spinners. They're terrible. You're just telling people to wait. But I think, what we need to do is collaborate more, and you need to say to your design teams, hey, this is a movie we're making. what's going to happen in that very first half a second? Then what happens? Then what happens after that? And that needs to be part of the design process so that that can be crafted. So let's have a look at some of our metrics and the sorts of things that they are blocked by if we're trying to improve the speed and improve these key metrics that we want to focus on here. So if we think about start render, obviously we've got our blocking CSS and our blocking JavaScript. You've just got to get rid of those. And that's also the number one thing that comes back from Lighthouse and Google PageSpeed Insights. It's like this, you've just got to move on. There's still lots and lots of sites that have blocking JS and blocking JavaScript. You just got to get rid of it. And there's really good techniques for doing that. Inlining your critical CSS is absolutely kind of crucial. And then, lazy loading the rest of your CSS. And the same thing with blocking JS. Ideally deferring it. Async is not enough. Async still executes and parses as soon as that resource is downloaded. You want to kind of defer it, or better still, kind of lazy load it so that you're not interrupting the CPU when it's trying to paint. And then when we're thinking about start render, obviously things like web fonts, the new display options for web fonts are fantastic. I really like optional, which gives the browser the choice. If the network's slow and it's on mobile, then it's just not even going to render that font. And you don't have this awkward, well, I was reading something and then I had that flout and now I've got, my font kind of rendered. So I think display optional is the best way to give permission to the browser to choose whether it should actually show that font. So I'm just going to quickly dive into one technique here which I really like to do with start render. And I'm going to pick on the Nickelodeon here and really talk about this technique of unblocking and then inlining that critical CSS. And the way we're going to do this is once we've unblocked the CSS and the JavaScript, then we're kind of free to think about what happens in that very, very first network request. And that's where you should be inlining that critical CSS. And so here I've just made a really simple example skeleton screen. And so I don't have all my content yet. You might still have gone out to the back end to be querying databases and showing things, but I can get a brand color in here. I can probably do a nice kind of SVG logo and do that as a data URI in the page. I can paint some squares. I can make the user feel like they're in the right place. And the thing that always fascinates me about this is that you can do a lot. You can, when you say to a designer, hey, you've got 14K of CSS to play with, that's a huge amount of layout and kind of grids and colors and logos and all sorts of things that I can be doing with that. That 14K comes from a really fantastic talk that Ilya Grigorik did about trying to render on mobile in under a second. And so really think hard about that first request. If you're thinking about it as a time-based experience, you're wanting to get to that point as soon as possible. And the difference can be like night and day. So I did a quick dirty kind of test here where this was the original Nickelodeon site, and you can see at 8 seconds it was still barely starting to render some of the content. Whereas if we unblock the CSS and the JavaScript and we do an inline critical CSS of just some of our brand elements and the logo, in that very first request we can be painting a picture. We can be telling people that are in the right place. And that should load in under half a second. So your goal should be to render in less than half a second. I would say 200 or 300 milliseconds, because you're only talking about that first request. Nothing else. That very first request, I should see something. And that is not where we're at today. So that's kind of my challenge to you, and it's very, very achievable. Does take a bit of re-architecting sometimes, but it's a really great goal to kind of aim for. So last painted hero, again, it's blocked by CSS and JavaScript and web fonts, and we've got a couple of other things here that are blocking our hero image, right? So if the image is late to download, if I've got 50 images and they're all prioritized as high, what can we do? Well, there's the prefetch which we can use, so link kind of rel prefetch, which will help prioritize that image depending on where it is in the source order. So if it's not right at the top of your HTML, then you want to try and indicate to the browser that this is an important image. And as Patrick mentioned in the previous talk, there's some stuff coming with priority hints that will help that as well. And then if it's just slow, then all the great optimizing, image optimizing techniques that we know and love. And first interactive, again, blocked by CSS and JavaScript. I put it in here for all three because so you can see how important it is to not be doing those things. So you've got to really manage that flow of CSS and JavaScript. And obviously the thing that's delaying this metric is any activity that's over 50 milliseconds is going to keep pushing out this metric. So the way to manage that is to, if it's first party, is to break up your JavaScript into smaller functions. And if it's third party, like we saw on CNN, it's really about auditing and identifying those third parties and maybe putting an SLA in place. So not just how quickly does it respond or how big are those third party resources, but also how much CPU are they consuming in your experience. So think about how you can give those third parties a hard time and really get them to focus in on performance and CPU usage as well. So to summarize and sort of turn what I've talked about into, I guess, a set of principles that you might use in the team, this is the way that I'd kind of articulate the relationship between what you're trying to achieve and the key kind of metrics that we've talked about. So, really use that first request to tell people that they are in the right place. Use that inline CSS, render that brand experience and get them in there. Let them know they're in the right place while you then stream and flow in the rest of the content. Once you've done that, it's really about prioritizing and delivering that important visible content. So, our headlines, our web fonts, our key kind of large hero images. After all, that's what your users came to your experience for, and the way to measure that is with the last painted hero. Then we're adding in the functionality. So we want to add in that functionality and enable all those rich kind of feature sets without blocking the user interaction. So that's where we can use first interactive to make sure that we're providing a nice, smooth, non-janky experience for people. And then finally, we want to decide as a team what matters most. Time to first tweet, whatever the example is for your product or service. And we want to measure that using our user timing marks. And the beauty of that is that we can measure it both in synthetic and we can measure it in RUM. It is a web standard, so lots of tools support user timing. So even though you do need to do the work to instrument it, you get the benefit of being able to switch providers or move around and have that same metric be collected by all the good performance companies out there. And so, most importantly, I want you to really, never forget about those kind of users. That's what we're working in service of. We want to use these metrics to get as close as we can to the experiences that people are having. Do they have a fast or slow experience? And we want to do the work to make sure that when we add more and more content and more functionality to our sites, that we're actually making those sites faster and a lot more joyous to use. And so finally, speaking of being joyous, SpeedCurve is hosting the closing kind of drinks. So I get to buy you all a beer now, which is really nice. So please come and join us at the closing reception, which is on now. And if you have any questions, feel free to grab any of the SpeedCurve team that you see wandering around. And all the content that I've talked about today and the rendering metrics picker, you can find those on our blog at speedcurve.com/blog. Great. Thank you.